Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside Europe's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter and I'll be your host for today's show. We're going to be talking about risk management oversight, the potential impact of geopolitical risk. And joining me as an expert in that field, Richard Fenning, who's the former CEO of Control Risk. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
So I know that you've spent literally your career going in and talking to managements and boards about this risk. But it's pretty expansive. So could we start by just trying to define it enough so that we can move forward with some recommendations here?
Well, I guess in its essence, it's the risks of negative impact on the business from the actions of governments around the world. I mean, you can take it broader than that, you can take it narrower than that, but I think that's kind of what we're talking about. It's the stuff that directly affects the everyday operations of the business, or indeed the future plans of the business. The difficulty slightly of defining it is that you end up trying to define the entire universe. And I always try and encourage boards to really focus on the stuff that they can do something about. I mean, they're going to worry about everything, right? Yeah. But there's a kind of imperative to really focus your anxieties and your concerns on stuff that you can do something about. You can take evasive action as a board to avoid some of these pitfalls.
And in a simple sense, if we were given examples, it would be US-China trade wars, Brexit, Middle East. Those would be examples of geopolitical events that impact companies.
Exactly. So some of those, we can't control the, sort of ordinary human beings, we can't control the kind of narrative surrounding the US-China trade war, but we can prepare our businesses for it.
Right.
And we have to think through the implications, what that means to our supply chains, what that means in terms of our kind of currency exposure. There is stuff that we can do once we boil it down to the practicalities.
And that's a great segue into what we're going to do. So there's two things that I'd like you to address. First is, how does a board educate themselves in this space and understand what the geopolitical risks are and how they will affect their business? And two, how can the board make sure that management is working all that into their planning and their ERM?
Right. So I think the first thing to acknowledge is that individual board members can never have perfect knowledge about everything that's happening in the world. They do, of course, have an obligation, I think, to keep themselves well abreast of the major issues that are affecting the company and indeed the kind of broader economy that they're concerned with. But they mustn't mistake that for an obligation to become expert in everything. They have to know how to access expert sources. They have to make sure that the board is regularly briefed by people who have a different perspective and a different opinion from that may be prevalent within the boardroom on an ordinary day. I think going beyond that, and there are many sources of information, and many boards contain former ambassadors, former people with a kind of diplomatic or international affairs background who are increasingly in demand given the nature of what's happening, right. All these different fault lines, many of which you've just mentioned. So there are some sort of fairly obvious steps in which we can improve the basic literacy of the board. But what's important, I think, is for the board to be provoked, for want of a better verb, for the board to be provoked. And that means testing the assumptions of senior board members, both non-executive board members and, of course, the kind of executive component of a board, to make sure that they really are thinking through the implications of what's happening in the world. All too often what we see is groupthink. We see people who kind of readily agree with each other, just discussing the same old issues. And I think it's important that people are left feeling that they have been properly challenged. And one of the counterintuitive lessons that I've learned over the years is that people who have spent a long time in a particular geography, are really immersed in it, have been through some rough times and some good times, are often the worst judges of what is going to happen there. And the problem is that they come kind of bearing their scar tissue and their battle scars into the boardroom and say, I know everything about the Middle East, I know everything about Africa or China or wherever it may be. And the board sits back and admires the expertise that is oozing from these individuals and then readily agrees with them. And very often, the more you're immersed in a particular geography, the less able you are to spot when it's changing. And change often comes very quickly. And we think of the whole situation in the Middle East has been turned upside down over the summer of 2019. China's going through the most extraordinary rapid changes. And often if you've been kind of so involved in those kind of places, you don't spot the change coming. The role of the board is not to out-expert the experts, but to know which questions to ask and to challenge the status quo, and at times go out on a bit of a limb and really push, make people move out of their immediate comfort zone, pull back from just readily accepting the wisdom of a so-called expert, and be really quite, as I say, provocative.
Well, and particularly in the planning or setting up ERM systems, it's a great way to sort of test the confidence of management too, and how they've incorporated these into their plan. But as you say, it's the discipline of provoking that kind of discussion, because if they don't ask the questions, they're not going to know the answer.
And ERM systems are an invaluable part of any business. Of course, they're now an established part of how we run major enterprises. The standing joke is that the crisis that then comes along is the one that you haven't thought of on the risk register. That's fine. We shouldn't be ashamed of that. We're fallible human beings. We can't think of everything. You should think of ERM processes as like going to the gym for the organization. They're keeping you fit, they're keeping you toned, they're keeping you battle ready, so that when something does happen that surprises the organization, you're kind of prepared. You've got to be adaptable, you've got to be flexible, you've got to take learnings from one part of the business and apply it at short notice. Never enough information to something else that's cropped up. But if you haven't practiced at all, then you're going to be in a much worse position. But we should never anticipate that we've anticipated everything.
Yeah. Well, and this goes to the point that we both heard today, that you can't finish the ERM process and then go and put it on the shelf and say, oh, good, that's done. Let's wait. Now we can wait till next year till we have to do it again. That has to be inbred in the decision making and what's going.
It has to be. And in the event of an organization suddenly finding themselves caught up in some kind of crisis, it can be geopolitical in its origin, it can be anything. It's a really good argument for diversity and inclusiveness in the boardroom and indeed in the senior leadership team. Very often, senior management teams that over the years have become very familiar with each other, don't challenge each other enough, start to think the same, are not great at handling some kind of emergency. You need a variety of people, you need different outlooks, you need different perspectives, you need introverts as well as extroverts, you need people of action as well as people who are more reflective. You need that combination, because what you're doing, particularly in this sort of fast-driven media world that we live in, you're trying to get to a definitive set of action. You never have enough time, you never have enough information. And you're not necessarily trying to find the very best possible course of action, sometimes trying to find the least worst. And if that sounds somewhat defeatist, it is at least realistic, because that's the reality for many companies.
Yeah. So knowing how well you know this field, I have to ask you this question. So what do you worry about, or what might keep you up at night when you look across the geopolitical risks that exist today that might affect our global society? What sort of worries you the most?
I think there are a couple of things. One is I worry about a generation now, maybe we call them millennials or the generation just above that, who have lost faith in the political process because politics has become, we're going through a phase in the world where it's changing, and for a lot of young people, they look at the political environment and they think, that's a load of rubbish, that's not for me. And it may be imperfect, but it's the best hope we have. So it's political engagement amongst that generation of people. I really would like to feel that their faith can be restored in the, as I say, in the least worst process we have for managing our affairs. And if I could just squeeze in a second one, it would be about the technological capabilities of the generation of people who currently are running organizations sitting on boards. Some of them, of course, have got it. A lot of them haven't. The generation behind them probably has. So we're probably in a sort of transitional phase. And yet the technological advances are happening at a speed that we can't wait for the generation that's coming up behind ours to be able to kind of take the reins in time. And it's that education, it's that knowledge deficit that worries me for the fate of a lot of companies that need to make some serious adjustments, and they don't necessarily have the kind of depth of experience at the top of organizations.
I don't think there's ever been a time when the leadership has had to deal with issues that they had no experience during their careers with.
Right.
Okay? And I'm sure that's the point that you're making. That
Yeah, it's generals that have never been to war. That's
right.
that's the issue that we're faced with. Yeah.
Well, Richard, thank you again for taking the time to join us and give us your perspectives. Much appreciated.
My pleasure.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside Europe's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again soon with another critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.